I'm Phil Jennings. So I am speaking to you tonight from sunny Wirral, where I'm a GP and former cardiology gypsy. But for about the last 6 years, been working at the Innovation Agency, the last 2 as chief exec. And AHSNs, which we're an example of, we've had quite a long history in cardiovascular disease, initially mostly around atrial fibrillation, actually, but more latterly supported cholesterol, which is why I'm talking to you this evening. So Mo and I are going to do a kind of hamburger style presentation. So I'm going to set the scene with a bit of context, and then Mo's going to take over, and then I'm going to finish off. So I think just to begin with, a few kind of obvious things to start. I know some of you will have been on the meeting a couple of weeks ago, so some of this is duplication, but I don't think there's any harm in kind of really reiterating the challenge that cardiovascular disease presents to us, both in primary care and more widely kind of as a health system. So the figures you can see here are pretty staggering, and the costs to the service there, that's £7.4 billion. It's actually quite an underestimate because that's just treatment costs. And again, if you factor in things like lost productivity or carers costs, actually that figure might be as much as double what I'm showing tonight. And clearly in terms of impact to health, cardiovascular disease is a leading cause of both morbidity and mortality in our country. And the thing is, it's worse. So these are historical figures from the British Heart Foundation, but what we know coming out of the pandemic is that during the pandemic, we were all refocused on treating COVID and the vaccination program. So actually, some of the business as usual that we've been very good at over the years in primary care in terms of chronic disease management has taken a hit, and for understandable reasons. But we know that from some recent work published from Julian Newton up in Newcastle that the numbers of patients who've been both started on a statin or switched from a regular statin to a high intensity statin has fallen by about a third during the COVID period. So we're at the moment starting to see some of the impacts of that in terms of increased patients turning up with heart attacks and strokes. And I think we're going to be combating the lag from that for a number of years to come. And this is all in the context of and a plateau in terms of life expectancy that we see more generally, and in some populations even a reversal. So for young females in particular, we're seeing not just a plateau but actually some fall in life expectancy. So whilst you may have heard a lot of this before, it's just as important as it's ever been, and that's why it continues to be a focus in our work. So this slide is really here to just demonstrate the link between cardiovascular event rates and deprivation. So we used to say this looked a lot like the Premier League table. So you've got Manchester up here, that's both City and United, and then Liverpool not far behind, Arsenal and Newcastle in the mix as well. So whilst we might have a lot to be proud of up here in the Northwest, from a footballing perspective, at least, there are many other tables where we don't do so well. And we've recognised now for a long time that there's a clear link between levels of deprivation and cardiovascular event rates. And whilst there's pockets of deprivation almost anywhere that we look, there remains quite a stark contrast between the north and the south of the country. And some of our northern inner cities remain real hotspots in terms of numbers of patients who are going untreated and dying prematurely as a result of cardiovascular disease. So ABC, in many ways, cardiovascular treatment should be pretty straightforward, as easy as ABC in many ways. So these are all established conditions. We've got well-known, well-recognized diagnostic criteria for each of them. We've got ready available diagnostics, which are simple and cheap and widespread throughout both primary, secondary, and the community. And again, for each of them, we've got a range of evidence-based therapies. So in many ways, you kind of might think, oh, well, this kind of should be job done, but of course it's not, because the other similarity that we see here with the ABC is that in each condition, we know that we continually miss patients. So when we look at the expected prevalence opposed to the observed numbers on QOF registers, for instance, we regularly see that we're missing patients. And again, we know that those patients tend to be from seldom heard communities, so they've probably already suffered some kind of health inequality, but this has been worsened by cardiovascular disease as well. And then the second commonality is that even when we have made the diagnosis, we continually fail to treat to target. So we either don't anticoagulate properly, we fail to reach hypertension targets, or we fail to reach cholesterol targets. And we'll see more of that as we go through the talk. So I'm going to focus more on cholesterol now. And here we see the link between cholesterol and cardiovascular event rates. So there are not many kind of truths out there in medicine or life more generally, but one of the things that we've come to recognize there is a really clear relationship between LDL-C levels and cardiovascular event rates. And this slide shows a number of different studies from across the world, which have all shown that as we reduce LDL-C levels, we see a corresponding reduction in cardiovascular event rates by about 22%. And it doesn't matter where in the world we look at this, or indeed what kind of study design we use to demonstrate it, it's a really consistent feature. And so where we're looking at therapies that are reducing LDL, we can be confident that that should see a corresponding change in the cardiovascular event rates. And again, over time, guidelines have matured, and we've now begun to identify and stratify patients much more than we did in the past. So again, here, this is European guidelines that we can see now that we identify what we define as a very high risk group of patients. So here you can see these are patients who have either got cardiovascular disease, so they've had a clinical event, or we've seen it on imaging, or they've got a very high risk score of 10% or more. And then there are other categories falling out from that. And what we've come to realize is for those patients who have the very highest score, we need to look at trying to reduce their cholesterol to lower and lower levels and have much more stringent targets. So again, you can see here from the European guidelines that for those very high risk group of patients, we're now aiming for a 1.4 millimole per litre LDL level, 1.8 for high risk, and then slightly lower targets for those lower risk. So I suppose it's just recognizing that for those patients with the highest risk, we should be looking for the greatest reduction in their cholesterol levels. And we know that once we get down to that 1.8 level, that's when we start to see an arrest of plaque progression, or even a reversal in some times. So there is evidence behind that, why we should be looking for those more ambitious targets in these very high-risk patients. But of course, doing that in practice remains a really big challenge, and it's much easier said than done, as I'm sure you'll all recognise on the call. So again, looking here at this European data, you can see that in this particular study, only a third of patients actually achieved their cholesterol goal. And rather paradoxically, it was those patients who had the highest starting risk who had the lowest chance of getting down to a level. And in fact, when you looked at monotherapy, over 80% of patients were unable to get to their levels with just monotherapy, for which in most patients that's a statin, not exclusively, but mainly. And although this is European data, it does translate pretty well into the kind of more national picture. So we know from CVD Prevent data, we can see here that about 76% of patients have not managed to get to that 1.8 level, or the high risk level of their LDL-C. And again, that's more than 3 in 4 patients. So it's a huge number, a massive challenge. And looked at in a different way, again, these figures estimate that overall, we've got about 3.5 million patients in the UK who've got an established diagnosis of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And there's about 2.5 million of them who need some further optimization to get down to the proper target. So we've had a number of novel therapies, the subject for this evening, launched recently. There was an AAC, which is the Accelerated Access Collaborative in NHS England, and NICE approved guideline, which I think attempted to cover all of that. Some of you may have seen it. It's a fairly busy kind of thing and perhaps not that user-friendly or penetrable in a very short consultation. So one of the areas of work that we've been involved with is to try to refine that into 2 guidelines, one for primary care and one for secondary care. And it's the primary care one that I'm demonstrating here this evening. I'm not going to go through it because you can download these yourself from the AHSN network website, but there are kind of 3 elements that I would want to draw your attention to. So first and foremost, I think, as you might expect, statins are still first. So none of what we're talking about here is about replacing statins as a first-line treatment for cholesterol lowering. That remains our kind of bedrock and cornerstone. And again, for most patients, statins can still be tolerated, and therefore we shouldn't be looking to replace them at this point. We're really talking tonight about add-on therapies to statins, but statins and lifestyle advice very much at the beginning of this guideline, which is where they should stay. The second major thing here is that we've signalled a departure from a 40% reduction, which I appreciate is not currently in line with NICE. Those of you who kind of follow what's going on at NICE at the minute will recognise that the NICE guideline is currently out for review. We're expecting some further publication around about September. NICE have also recognised that 40% is probably not the right way forward, but there remains a bit of debate within NICE about what the correct level is, and that's one of the things we're hoping that will be bottomed out later in the year. But in the meantime, the members of this expert group, which included a number of national clinical directors and people like Jim Moore from the Primary Care Cardiovascular Society, have adopted the 2.5 non-HDL level, which is equivalent to about 1.8 of LDL. And again, we recognise that not everybody has got access to full lipid profiles across the entirety of the country. So I thought it was both important to have both targets in there to make things more accessible to GPs, but also to move away from this 40%, which is difficult to use in practice. It's also has a number of other issues in terms of how that data is extracted and monitored. So, and it keeps us actually more in line with guidelines that we're seeing coming out of Europe and North America. So if you haven't seen that, do have a look at it, and it does provide, I think, a more straightforward pathway in terms of everyday clinical decision making that you can have a discussion with your patients about. The second thing, and I think what's been really important, is that we've lobbied very hard over the last 12 months for the inclusion of lipid management in QOF. And so we're pretty delighted that QOF this year has included these 2 new lipid indicators. And that's really, again, for 2 reasons. So one is that we've seen quite a lot of focus over the last 12 months on hypertension, which again is clearly a very, very important modifiable risk factor. But actually, the conversation has been drowned out somewhat by hypertension. And actually, cholesterol is right up there as well as an important modifiable risk factor. And we should be looking at both together. You probably recognise that as primary care physicians, and that your patients with cholesterol often have hypertension as well. But we think it's an important signal to try to level that playing field, and we need to be looking at both of them together. And of course, the other more practical thing is that it does provide some resource into practice in terms of some of the work that's involved in medicines optimization for these eligible patients. So there is some work with patient identification, and then reviews. And again, QOF hopefully will help to address that.